Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. On the second Wednesday of each month, and sometimes in between, we discuss the latest bioscience publications. And as a reminder, if you'd like to read more, point your browser to academic.oup.com/bioscience. For today's episode, I'm joined by Earl Ellis of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and Thomas Campagnaro and Tommaso Sizia, who are both at the University of Padova. They joined me from Baltimore and Italy, respectively, to discuss Natura 2000, which is a protected area network in Europe. In particular, their article was focused on the ways in which that network might be scaled up more broadly, with the ultimate hope of protecting half of the Earth's land and seascapes. But I'll let them explain that, the idea behind it, and ultimately some of the ways in which it might be implemented in the future. So let's get straight to the interview. Thank you all very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Thank you for having us.
Before we get into this, the specific contents of the article itself and the Natura 2000 initiative and framework, I was hoping we could chat just a little bit about this idea of preserving half of the Earth, its origins, and kind of how that's being thought about in the community. And I'll leave that open to anyone who'd like to take it.
I guess I could start with that because I have been working in it since I met Eric Dinnerstein, who's one of the leaders in what's called the Nature Needs Half movement, which is very closely related to the half Earth, but actually precedes it by a few years. It was actually came about through an analysis of different conservation strategies and looking at a variety of targets, and the number 50% seemed to represent a safe level of protected areas in a lot of strategic biodiversity planning in a study that was done, I think in 2013. And so at that point, a bunch of folks, and Harvey Locke was the person who really promoted it the most, promoted this idea of nature needs half. And then a few years later, we have the Half Earth book by E.O. Wilson, which calls for a very similar idea of conserving half the planet for biodiversity.
So if you preserve half, you have a good shot at preserving, a large amount of the Earth's biodiversity. That's
the idea, and like I said, the earliest assessment was based on conservation targets that already exist in different countries, and that were derived by scientific methods. But there's also the basic island biogeography theory that basically that's the basis for E.O. Wilson's assessment of what it takes to preserve about 85% or more of biodiversity. In theory, should be preserved by 50% of habitat.
Okay, and now for the rest of our discussion, though, we'll be talking about a conservation network that was initiated a little bit well before this half Earth idea came about. But it might be a path to to getting there, or at least to kind of understanding those mechanisms. So we'll be talking about Natura 2000, and I was hoping that any or all of you could just sort of introduce me to that idea and kind of when that came about and what it seeks to do.
So basically, it's an effort which began in 1992. At that time, of course, European Union was not the European Union that we know today. So we have to consider that this effort improved with the years and with the increase of the number of member states included in the European Union. One of the main points was at that time to have just only one piece of regulation for all the member states. And of course, this is the reason why when Earl came to Padova University and gave a very inspiring presentation about the half Earth concept, we found that probably Natura 2000 can be also inspiring for this concept at the global level. The European Union does not aim to protect nature only inside the protected areas. This is one of the main points. because the idea is to conserve an ecological network of sites, including habitats, species, and habitats of species. Each of these elements have its own characteristics and its own level of conservation and requirements, which of course would need probably an entire week to be explained in the details. But that's, I think, the in general the main aim of the Habitats Directive.
Okay, so the idea there being that you could preserve these areas and also ensure that they were interconnected and actually useful, because it seems that one of the potential pitfalls of a conservation network of protected areas would be if it were not set up in a way that allowed connectivity between areas, or that selected areas that were the most biodiverse or most in need of protection, and instead just focused on those areas that were undeveloped. But it sounds like this network has been deliberately constructed in such a way that it will get the areas that are of most need included, and also allow those areas to connect across international borders.
Yes, so the main aim of the Habitats Directive, and therefore the creation of Natura 2000, is to achieve a good conservation status of habitats and species, as Tommaso said before. These are species and habitats are listed within the Habitats Directive. The point regarding connection between member states is in fact this, because we know that, of course, habitats and species are not constrained by our boundaries. And we have a number of Natura 2000 sites, in fact, that are neighboring in terms of member states. The other thing is that based on these on this directive, we have some common aspects throughout the different member states, that this favors again the connectivity. At the same time, the integration with the different planning tools, not only regarding conservation, favor this and favor connecting the different sites.
And I can say that one thing that really interested me when we began to talk about Natura 2000 together was this diversity of approaches. It's not just this idea, and it wouldn't be a viable idea in Europe anyway, of kind of keeping people out. This kind of fortress conservation really isn't part of the Natura 2000 strategy, yet it remains the largest conservation network of protected areas in the world. It also has a great diversity of strategies, from preserving practices of farming and agriculture that have a long history of conserving biodiversity, such as use of hedgerows and certain types of rangelands, are actually conservation strategies. And that connected very well with what Harvey Locke was talking about when he developed the IUCN category. So protected space, is not just a level 1 category where essentially the wilderness protection is the only goal. It rates all the way down to, say, level 6, and now even beyond, to this other effective conservation measures strategies, where you're basically doing lots of different incremental strategies to sustain biodiversity in a larger area. So half Earth is not just about this idea of setting aside half the Earth. It's really about changing the way that people interact with the entire planet. So that has a lot to do with the title of our piece, the whole Earth versus half Earth. Really half Earth is a whole Earth strategy.
Right. So it sounds like you could have a situation in which, areas that have been long inhabited by humans and, used for some purpose that is preserving of biodiversity as well, can remain so. And it's not just about, buying up land, moving people off of it if necessary, and, using that fortress conservation strategy. It's actually one that can be integrated with, human lifestyles that have been in place for a long time.
I mean, that's right. And I think the Europeans, and especially through their experience working internationally through Natura 2000 and the Habitats Directive, have a really unprecedented level of experience with working in that part of the world. And I think a lot of the world is really like that. Asia is like this. Africa is like this. This is not an unusual status, actually. It's very common to have huge areas that are a mixture of different land uses. And to do protection of biodiversity in those kinds of regions, you need this kind of integrated, very flexible set of strategies that work across different nations, across boundaries, and this sort of thing. And really the most major experience of that is really in the European system.
Yeah, I agree, Erle, because this binary way to protecting nature, of course, it was common also in Europe before the implementation of the Habitats Directive, because, of course, the first way and the more simple way to protect nature is to think of a binary landscape where you have only nature and where you have only humans. And still probably if we see in some national African parks, this is the way. I forgot to say that among the habitats, we have many so-called semi-natural habitats, whose conservation is directly associated to humans. As you said, farming is one of the activity which is not only allowed inside the protected areas according Habitats Directive, but even promoted. The same is valid for some systems of forest management. Of course, it's not always easy to transfer these concepts at European level, because as you can imagine, each country, even in Europe, has its own history of use and its own history of traditions in managing the landscapes. But of course, the idea is to have one single vocabulary, and I think this is very important to speak with each other. One single objective, and another point is not to fix a deadline. I think this is also something that many practitioners of Natura 2000 do not understand at the beginning. What the European Commission wants from the member states is that they achieve progresses towards an aim, a common aim, within, of course, the requirements of the Habitats Directive, which again, do not include only nature, but also social, economical, and cultural, and finally, scientific requirements, because science is one of the points that the Habitats Directive explicitly contains in one of its articles.
I just want to add a simple example to give an idea also of the overlap or the presence of protected areas as Natura 2000 within strongly areas strongly pressurized by humans or with a long history of human activities. If we think that nearly all the entire lagoon of Venice is a Natura 2000 site, and we know that Venice is one of the most important and attractive tourist cities all over the world. So the importance of protecting habitats and species in these contexts that are not remote areas but are intensively used lands in certain parts.
And this question may speak more to color rather than letter of the law, but I had a question about Natura 2000's inclusion of scientific information in its enforcement. This is not a system, unlike possibly some others, that's been designed by policymakers who are not working from an informed scientific viewpoint. What makes this different, and how are scientists brought into the mix? Either in establishing sites or monitoring and reporting and those types of things.
There is first the monitoring is done based on a 6 years report. These reports include also the mapping of the presence of the species and habitats based on a European Union level grid. And the contribution to this grid is done by usually scientific organizations or agencies under the control of the environmental authority of each member state. The advantage is that at the end we have one single map prepared with the same level of resolution and with the same level of, for example, just to say the same systems to interpolate the information, which is based on again manuals prepared by agencies of the European Union, like the European Environment Agency. Then, of course, at the level of each member state, these scientific agencies can consult universities when they have single issues to be addressed about single case studies. For example, our university just recently was involved in a case where one single amphibian was subject to a try for an infringement procedure because of the potential effects of forest management on its habitat, and so an experimental cut was done to check the effect of forest management on the habitat. So we concluded with data that the effect was negligible. This is just an example of how science can be involved in the application and implementation of the Habitats Directive at a local scale. But as I said, then there is also a global scale, especially involved in the reporting.
As you can imagine, the amount of knowledge and also data that is needed to understand if species are in a good conservation status, and also for different type of habitats, so the knowledge of populations and population dynamics, but also on the different structures and functions of the habitats. These are all aspects that need to be part of the reporting, as Tommaso was saying. And at the same time, knowledge of the possible actions made by humans to maintain, for example, semi-natural habitats, it is important and needs to have a strong scientific background to be carried out in a proper way and to maintain these habitats. And also, if we think that in many situations and in many sites, there is an important effort towards the restorations of different habitats.
Okay, I think that gives our listeners a very good overview of the network. Now, I guess the next question then would be, how has it worked? And, how have the conservation outcomes differed, since the implementation versus those prior? Is more area protected than it previously was? And, are we seeing the types of biodiversity outcomes that we would like to see? In short, is it working?
So, but if we think about area, of course, through time, we have seen an increase in land and also seascape protected. One important aspect that is taken into consideration now is to improve the area within Natura 2000 regarding marine habitats and, of course, so the seascape. We have now around 18%, so 1/5 on the EU land covered by Natura 2000 and nearly 10% of the seascape of the EU. Before of it, the percentage was, of course, minor, but it is difficult to have this precise information rather than what we have now. And in perspective of what we have achieved in terms of conservation status of these species, of course, and of habitats, in general, we have some contradicting aspects, but the point is that more effort, of course, is needed, even though we see that for many species we had an improvement. And and also for certain habitats, but the point is that the aim is to have all species and habitats listed in the directive in a favorable conservation status. So that is the aim, and therefore the focus is more to see what is still needed rather than to sponsor the targets that have been achieved.
Yes, if I can add something, there are some habitats in particular where the progress is more difficult to be achieved. For example, one point, given that we spoke of semi-natural habitats, is to provide the ways to support active management approaches. Sometimes probably, especially for very marginal areas, it's easier to do nothing. It's more difficult to convince landowners to act. One example is the grasslands, which depends on mowing or pasture, so grazing. In this case, progresses are also, we can quantify them also in terms of the way money from the European Union are used by member states. One important thing is that member states can rely on specific fundings dedicated to Natura 2000. The choice to use these depends on decisions taken also at the regional level. So it depends on the stakeholder participation. So when we talk of the progress, I think in Natura 2000 we have not only to consider the natural aspects but also the stakeholder involvement. And I think, based on my experience since the beginning of this millennia, because it was in 2000 more or less, I saw a much more involvement of people and awareness of the existence of the Natura 2000 network. There are conflicts, of course. It's not all, there are not only flowers, of course, in the grassland. Sometimes we have to consider that there are also conflicts, but I think that often they are linked to a non-complete knowledge of the regulation and not complete knowledge of the opportunities that this piece of regulation can give to stakeholders. That's I think the main point. But you can see the progresses based on this reporting every 6 years, when they are all very careful assessed. Even, of course, sometimes based on expert judgment, especially when we have to do estimation at biogeographical level.
Just to give another example, with what, and in line with what just Tommaso said, in the area where we lived, so the northeastern part of Italy, in the last years we have seen an increase in the number of wolves, for example, that were not present in the last decades in the area. So this can be seen as a positive outcome from a conservation perspective, but at the same time now we are facing conflicts with stakeholders, especially with farmers, and of course related to keeping sheep and pastures.
Yeah, and that's a topic that'll be familiar to longtime listeners of the podcast as well. We've talked about wolves and their reemergence in Europe a few times, and that was always fascinating. So this sounds like a highly successful network, and that leads me then to my last question or set of questions, which is admittedly quite unfair, and that kind of line of questioning is about how would this type of approach be expanded on a global scale? You know. The European Union is in many senses unique in that it's a governance structure that's cross-national, that has some real enforcement capabilities. You know, are there any ideas for potentially first steps that could be taken, you know, on a global scale that would allow something like this to be enacted throughout the world with the vision of eventually getting toward that sort of half-Earth preservation?
Yeah, indeed, a very challenging question. And I think that's the really big, interesting, open question about the half-Earth proposal is how do you really get there? Because really where we're at right now is we're at about 17% or so, supposed to get at least to 18 or so with existing targets. And now people are talking about 30% by 2030 and even 50% by 2050. But I have to say that it's a very different type of activity. It's a gigantic social process, obviously. It has to be international. It has to operate globally, regionally, and locally. And when it gets past, you know, a quarter or so, 25% or so, you're inevitably getting into issues where you have to consider other forms of land use besides just conservation. Because you start to eat into areas where you have agriculture and production for human societies, which obviously, you know, our demands for land and even the ocean are not decreasing, they're increasing. So how to actually scale up, and that's the same is true for Natura 2000. One thing we wanted to talk about that we didn't really get into in the paper, but maybe in a subsequent paper, is what would half Europe look like? So if you actually tried to go to that level within the European continent, what would it take? And that's assuming, right, that we already have a European Union to operate with, you know, which includes a whole system of legal protections and ways of operating politically and socially, built in. Even doing that sounds very challenging, and it's not really clear how doable it is. 50% by 2050 in Europe through the Natura 2000 network, I don't know. And obviously taking it to the next level, going to a system beyond any particular, governmental network, like, say across the entire, Europe and Asia, because they're obviously connected together. How do you go there? That's an even bigger question. Or in areas where governance is an issue, especially, at international levels, governance across, say, Africa, there's a lot of very different types of challenges there. So, yeah, I don't think there's any simple answers here. But on the other hand, you have to start with experience, I think. If you just treat everything as an unprecedented effort, you can't learn from what we already know. And I think Natura 2000 does teach us some really key lessons about what it takes to bring people together across countries, to bring nature together across countries, to connect, to use relationships locally, regionally, and globally to build a stronger conservation network that works, that protects biodiversity, that brings back species that have been very limited in their range. So I think that we have to build on that effort, but there's not going to be a simple just do what they did in Natura 2000 prescription. There's no panacea here. It's going to be a long-term challenge to build a stronger effort to conserve Earth's biodiversity, hopefully at this level of really planetary scale.
El, I don't know if I can add to your comment that if I remember one of the first points we said when we began to prepare this article was that the area-based approach maybe is not the only approach to calculate the surface of Europe, but also of the world protected, because just the example of the environmental assessment under Habitats Directive, it's a good example because it applies also outside the protected areas, the Natura 2000 sites. And the same is valid for the reporting. The grid that I mentioned about the distribution of species and habitats, it's a grid which covers all Europe, not only the areas which boundaries are identified. Therefore, probably, even if we calculated 18% of the terrestrial area covered by Natura 2000, it is indeed more if we would be able to assess the buffer, and not only buffer in the geometrical meaning, but also in terms of social involvement and social, if we speak of humans, but also the connection and the connectivity if we speak of animals and plants. So probably we should also think about the advance or integration of the area-based approach with other ways to assess the level of protection.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and I think that really needs to be reiterated. Although, like we said, we didn't actually try to do that kind of assessment. I think maybe that's something to think about now for future work. Is how do you assess, conservation strategies that aren't just area-based? How do you put together an assessment of how well you're doing and what your targets are? Because it's true. It's much too simple just to say 50% is protected, because what does that mean? There's so many ways to conserve biodiversity, and protected areas are not even the best way for a lot of species. So trying to put together a more comprehensive way of forming a proactive target. What do we want to do with biodiversity protection globally? What's the ultimate goal? It's not just 50%, right? I think it's a lot more than that, and that's a great piece of work that I think the Europeans again could lead in this. How should we assess the success of Natura 2000 as a project, and what would be the goal in 2050 of Natura 2000?
Yeah, I think at the beginning I was surprised also about the lack of knowledge of Natura 2000 outside Europe. I think this is still probably a missing point, a missing achievement of Natura 2000, the communication and dissemination of interesting concepts, but not only concepts, as I said, also tools and vocabulary, which maybe can be transposed outside Europe in different, similar or integrated ways that how we applied in Europe.
Well, I think the three of you have done a very good job today in communicating that message, and I hope that it catches on among our listeners, and more people outside of the European Union become aware of Natura 2000 and its successes and its potential as a basis for further conservation efforts across the globe and into the future as those targets are set, met and achieved, reported on, and we preserve the biodiversity that we're seeking to preserve. But anyway, thank you all very much for joining me today. It's been a great episode, and I've learned quite a bit from it.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, James.
Thank you, James.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just as a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.